mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's irrelevant. It's about 1.5 billion that measure is intended to raise, which in the context of a trillion pounds of overall tax, it's nothing. It's not even worth talking about. It hits the headlines a lot because it has a lot of political salience. People who send their children to private schools are obviously not vastly in favour of their fees going up 15 or 20%. People who don't are not that sympathetic. So it's got political salience, but in tax terms, it's not terribly significant.
And the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, will unveil the results of her spending audit tomorrow, and she's warning the picture isn't pretty. The Sunday Times reports today that the Chancellor will have some strong words for the Conservatives, whom she accuses of making a mess of the public finances. In order to cover the approximately £20 billion black hole, Reeves is expected to cut projects and raise taxes in the autumn budget. So what are some of the options on the table? And should Labour really have been surprised at the scale of the crisis? Well, joining me now is Dan Neidle, tax expert, commentator, and founder of Tax Policy Associates. Dan, hello to you. Hello, Dan. Can you hear me? Dan Neidle.
I can hear you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. You'll have seen the front page of the Sunday Times, the headline, £20 billion black hole, in quotes, covered up by Tories. What do you make of that? Is that fair? Is it credible? Or do you think actually Labour is playing around here? They're softening us up for something?
Gosh, I'm a tax guy, not a spending guy.
Yes.
And it seems she isn't saying there's a hole in the tax side. She's saying there's a whole bunch of spending which should have been made, hasn't been made. So there's a black hole. It's a bit like we heard in 2010 when after the Tories got in, they said, the situation's much worse than we thought. And they cut a lot of spending as a result. It seems from the Sunday Times that Labour are going to not cut spending per se, but perhaps raise some tax, perhaps cut some infrastructure projects. The tax side of that is going to be kind of challenging, I think.
Okay, and when you say challenging, what do you mean? Let's say we know that the Chancellor is going to level with us and give us the bad news, and they can do so because they've got a huge majority. What do you think is going to be in her mind?
Well, we raise about £1 billion of tax in this country, but
$1 billion? You mean trillion? Is it
about about £1 trillion?
Yes,
exactly. About a trillion of tax. Where does it come from? Well, about 85% of that comes from income tax, national insurance, VAT, and corporation tax. But during the election campaign, Labour said they wouldn't be raising those, so they've immediately ruled out the vast majority of taxes that you could raise in order to do this. So some quick maths, that's 85%. So that leaves you with about 150 billion of the other taxes. Well, raising 20 billion out of those is going to be challenging. And where's it going to come from? Is it going to come from council tax? You could, for example, raise council tax on higher value properties. That could raise a couple of billion. Will it come from stamp duty? That kind of feels high enough already. Will it come from raising capital gains tax? Maybe, but you can, again, I think only raise a couple of billion from that. So you can grab little bits here and little bits there, but it's not an easy game.
And when you say grab little bits here and there, what do you think the low-hanging fruit might be? I mean, I know that you're a tax guy, not a spending guy. You're not a politician. But you will know the kind of sums, the kind of maths that people will be doing, and they'll be looking for big-ticket items. What are the big-ticket items? What about pensions, for example?
Yeah, so it's often discussed that you could limit tax relief for pensions. So at the moment, if you are a high earner in the 45% tax band, then you get 45% tax relief for contribution to your pension. And it's sometimes suggested you should cap this, say, at maybe 30%. And that could raise quite a large amount of money. It would be politically somewhat unpopular. It's also not that favoured by people like the IFS, who say that it would discourage people to save. But that is a relatively easy and straightforward way to raise quite a serious amount of money.
People say that the private school VAT, or removing protection from schools, from private schools, won't raise that much. Why is there so much uncertainty about that particular measure? Because I keep seeing a lot here and there, but that's not quite clear.
I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's irrelevant. It's about 1.5 billion that measure is intended to raise, which in the context of £1 trillion of overall tax. It's nothing. It's not even worth talking about. It hits the headlines a lot because it has a lot of political salience. People who send their children to private schools are obviously not vastly in favour of their fees going up 15 or 20%. People who don't are not that sympathetic. So it's got political salience, but in tax terms, it's not terribly significant.
Yeah. And earlier on Times Radio, we had a Labour spokesperson, Steve Reed, the Environment Secretary, and then John Glenn, the former Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Both of them trading accusations. The Labour saying the Tory have laid traps for us, and the Tories saying no. Everything was clear. We have the Office of Budget Responsibility. We've had it since 2010. We're trying to work out who is right about this, and if when the Office of Budget Responsibility pronounces we're not getting the full picture, then how do we reform it? What do we need to do?
Well, I think the supposed black hole is on the spending side. How credible that turns out to be, well, let's see what Rachel Reeves says. But if you don't mind, I'm not going to guess now what she might say, and it's kind of not tax, so it's not really my thing. I'm going to be boring.
No, it's all right. Dan, let me ask you this broader question then, because the Conservatives have often said we're a low tax party, and Labour wants to get away from this image of being a high tax party. When it comes to GB PLC, when it comes to Great Britain, when you compare us with our European neighbours, where do we fall? Are we broadly a low tax country, or are we in the middle, European average, or are we kind of on the higher side?
So we are in international terms pretty low, particularly if you rule out city-states like Singapore, small countries like Switzerland, Ireland. We have a significantly lower percentage of the overall GDP paid in tax in those countries. So in the UK, it's somewhere around 34%. In France, it's pushing 50%. In Denmark, it's about 45%. So we are generally speaking, relatively speaking, a fairly low tax country. People often find that hard to believe, but that is nevertheless the truth. It is also true that we as a country are paying significantly more tax than at any time since the war.
All right.
And that's not so much because government's been extravagant with its spending, it's because demographic change means that we now have fewer young people supporting more old people, and we have not achieved GDP growth that would enable us to grow our way out of the problem. So the only way to pay for this demographic issue has been tax. That plus COVID has meant that there was a sudden jump up in tax from about sort of 32% of GDP to well over 35%. Following the pandemic, and that's been sustained, and there aren't many signs of it coming down.
All right, Dan, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio. It's Dan Neidle, tax expert, commentator, and founder of Tax Policy Associates.